The march towards liberty starts now. This is Freedom Watch. Tonight on the docket, does the federal government even know what it's doing anymore? We'll ask Senator Orrin Hatch that question a little later in the show. But first, what does it say about the competence of the federal government that it faces the prospect of yet another shutdown at the end of the week? And no one seems to care. This has happened so many times in recent months, it has become routine. The bizarre has become routine. For the past several years, instead of passing a budget, Congress has functioned on the basis of continuing resolutions. That is, ad hoc spending bills that fund the government for a small and limited period of time and prevent the entire operation from shutting down. President Obama has signed 14 continuing resolutions so far, 9 alone in the last year. Last month, Congress passed a continuing resolution to avert a government shutdown just before Thanksgiving and kept the government running for a month. That's till Friday. So now Congress must again reach a deal to fund the government on the eve, well, 2 weeks before a major holiday. What kind of an organization is so dysfunctional it must fund itself on a monthly basis? More importantly, what kind of an organization sets a goal to make a $1.2 trillion reduction from planned spending and then fails to do so and responds by squabbling over a temporary extension of a 2% cut in payroll taxes? This can only happen in Washington. For answers first, we turn to the Cato Institute Senior Vice President, David Bose. David, welcome back to Freedom Watch.
Thank you.
Surprised that we're here doing this all over again, the 14th continuing resolution of his presidency?
You know, I wasn't even really paying attention, and I think it's partly because, like you said, they keep doing this, and one of the things that's happened each time they do it, including the debt ceiling, is there was panic in the media, but there wasn't that much panic in the markets. And so I think the members of Congress have gotten used to the idea that, well, nobody really cares that much anyway. And the problem is that they don't agree on what should be done. And since they don't agree, there's no long-term plan. And so they just deal in short-term plans. And if they were a business, they'd be out of business by now. But they're not a business.
Okay. They're not a business. They're the government. They have no competition. They have guaranteed income called taxes. They have guaranteed customers called taxpayers and voters. But doesn't this have some long-term harm when businesses want to plan, when markets want to plan, when rating agencies look at the federal government of the United States of America and see that perhaps your household and mine are run with more planning, with more time in advance than the federal government is?
Oh, it absolutely does. And it does reflect this long-term disaster that they're on that they absolutely don't want to pay any attention to. We have run up $14 trillion in national debt in just the past 30 years, for a total of $15 trillion now. What do they think they're doing? But the answer is the Democrats don't want to cut any spending. They just want to raise taxes. They want to raise taxes so bad they can taste it. They feel like they're so close to it. But the Republicans don't want to say no to anybody, so they aren't really passing spending cuts either.
You're not telling me Republicans want to spend and Democrats want to spend. It's just a difference in how much they want to spend?
It's not even a difference in how much, as much as it is. I think if the Republicans could have what's in their hearts, they'd spend more on defense and they probably would spend less on domestic policy. But they don't want to actually stand up and say no to any interest group, whether it's old people, farmers, drug counselors, whatever.
Is this a mess that small government constitutionalists like you and I and most people watching this show now want to put into the hands of Newt Gingrich?
Well, absolutely not. You know, if you talk to the people who worked with Gingrich when he was Speaker, they will tell you first about personality and character issues. They'll say he's volatile, he's megalomaniac, he's always talking about himself in these world historical terms, he's prone to tossing out ideas that he hasn't thought through and that he doesn't try to follow through on. Interesting guy to have in Congress, not the guy you want sitting in the Oval Office.
Would you want somebody in the Oval Office who was paid millions by Freddie and Fannie and who blessed their business model as recently as a year prior to the collapse of housing in 2008?
Better to think he was defending Freddie and Fannie for money than to think he actually believed in it. And that would be true also. You know, he supported the prescription drug entitlement from President Bush. Let's hope he did it because he was getting money from the pharmaceutical companies.
What will libertarians and small government folks do if it's somebody like Barack Obama against Newt Gingrich, both of whom on the same day 2 weeks ago compared themselves to Teddy Roosevelt?
It would be a very depressing possibility. There will be third-party candidates. There will be a Libertarian Party candidate.
You think that will happen?
Independent. Well, there'll be some Libertarian Party candidate. It may not be Ron Paul or Gary Johnson, but there'll be somebody. There might be an independent. There might be a lot of other options. There's also staying home as an option. In the final analysis, I think most small government people will want to remove Obama from office.
No matter who replaces him.
Well, Gingrich is certainly asking a lot.
Right. All right. David Bose, it's a pleasure. Thanks very much for joining us.
Thank you.
If Republican lawmakers are trying to find a way to abrogate their responsibility to balance the budget, they may have found a perfect means to do it with the Balanced Budget Amendment. The BBA, no matter what form it takes, will allow lawmakers basically to give up and shove their responsibility off onto the courts. This is exactly what will happen when lawsuits pop up concerning the budget, if and when the Balanced Budget Amendment is ever ratified. Utah Senator Orrin Hatch disagrees with me because he's the co-author of one of the two balanced budget amendments that the Senate is like to consider very soon. He's a good friend of the show, and we welcome him back. Senator Hatch, it's always a pleasure. Welcome back to Freedom Watch.
Well, nice to be with you, Judge. Keep doing the good job you're doing.
Thank you. Now, I know that you have struggled for many years to put a lid on federal spending, and you have not succeeded, no matter which party, your own or the Democrats, controlled the White House or the body in which you sit, the Senate. And I know that you believe in all your heart that the Balanced Budget Amendment will work. But if the Balanced Budget Amendment, yours and Mike Lee's, not Senator Udall's, the one that would require a two-thirds vote to change it, becomes the law, aren't we effectively changing spending power from the Congress and the president to the courts? Because if you want to spend more, isn't somebody going to sue and a federal judge will make these decisions?
Not according to the amendment we have. Our amendment would really put the screws to the Congress and just say, look, we're going to put a straitjacket on you because you guys can't get spending under control. And frankly, it's the liberal community that can't do it. I've been here a long time, and we have never had a fiscal conservative majority in the Senate. We've always had 3 to 6 more liberal Republicans who will go with the all-liberal Democrats, and we've just got to have that kind of restraint. I've actually sponsored or co-sponsored 20 different balanced budget amendments, and I've brought 5 to the floor, 2 of which came within 1 vote of passage. The last was in 1997. We lost it by 1 vote. I had 60 votes as I walked to the floor, and was ready to make the final arguments when I was told that John Hines of Pennsylvania had caved into the unions in his state, even though he'd been with us all the way through. And of course, we lost by 1 vote. We had 66 votes. We needed 67.
Aren't you likely to, even though this is clearly a step in the right direction, I have my misgivings about it, but it manifests, if it passes, an institutional intention to put a cap on federal spending. But aren't you likely to suffer the same fate now? Or stated differently, is there a chance this will pass the Senate and then the House and then be sent to the states?
Well, the important thing about this is the first time we've had every Republican on board, all 47. Now, we would need 20 Democrats to stand up and say, we're tired of what's happening to our country. We're going to vote for this, and we're going to get some spending restraint in the government of the United States. It's your best guess whether they'll do that. I personally think it's going to be very difficult for them to do it, but it's still a worthwhile thing to fight this matter so everybody in the country can understand.
And what you want everybody in the country to understand is that the spending is out of control, and the Congress cannot be trusted to spend the people's money because it will borrow more money than it collects, and it'll spend the borrowed money. But there is a provision in this amendment which would allow an override by a two-thirds vote. I'm wondering, might it be easier just to change the Senate rules to require a two-thirds vote to increase spending, rather than to try and change the fundamental law of the land and worry about getting this thing ratified by 3/4 of the states?
We've always tried methods like that, but nothing short of a constitutional amendment will solve this problem, and even that will be attacked by those who want to spend and spend and spend again. Remember when we did the Graham-Rumman haulings, it was a well-thought-out piece of legislation. It lasted about a year until they found ways around it and went right ahead with their spending programs. I think the only thing that's going to change this is a balanced budget amendment, and for the people out there to notice who voted for it and get rid of those who didn't vote for it.
All right, before I let you go, you are attempting to restrain the federal government from giving $75 billion to the International Monetary Fund so it can be wasted on the socialists in Europe. On that, of course, most people watching this show are 100% behind you. What are the chances that you can get undone what the Congress did in 2009 and President Obama signed into law?
Well, I think it's about $108 billion we're on the hook for, and I think we've got to fight that. And frankly, you know, when you've got Spain, Greece, and other Italy and a couple of other countries that are just plain living beyond their means, living in their socialist dream world, who, for instance, in Greece, a hairdresser who, because she's worked with peroxide, hydrogen peroxide, can take a full pension at age 50. I mean, my gosh, when are we going to wake up and realize we can't keep this? Yeah, we can't keep supporting that type of profligacy. It's just that simple. We shouldn't.
Good luck with these battles, Senator Hatch, and thanks very much for joining us.
Well, nice to be with you, Judge. Keep it up.
Thank you. Republicans are supposed to own the tax debate with Democrats. Instead, the GOP has gotten twisted up in a debate over a paltry payroll tax as Democrats gain traction with their class warfare strategy. So there are now 3 Republican solutions to the payroll tax dilemma. My next guest says his bill would offer the taxpayers a choice on whether to receive a payroll tax cut now by delaying their Social Security benefits for 1 month when it's time to collect. Here to explain is limited government conservative and good friend of the show, Congressman Tom McClintock from the People's Republic of California. Congressman McClintock, it's a pleasure, and an early Merry Christmas. Welcome back to the show.
Well, and Merry Christmas to you, Judge. Thank you. By the way, just to make it clear, it's not my bill. It's Jeff Landry who's introduced that bill of Louisiana. I'm a cheerleader for it, though. It's the first sensible approach to the issue that we've seen that links to the costs and the benefits of Social Security and gives every American their own choice as to whether to take the year's tax benefit and delay their retirement 1 month to pay for the cost of the cut.
So each individual American would be able to make that decision, get the tax cut and delay for a month, or don't get the tax cut and get Social Security in the very month that you choose to retire, which could be a year from now, 10 years from now, or 30 years from now.
Exactly, which means that every family can make its own decision according to its own circumstances, its own plans, its own needs, rather than the government making that decision for them. It would guarantee that that tax cut can be in place permanently, but at the same time without undermining the Social Security system.
Isn't that a little too much freedom of choice for this government, Congressman McClintock? They don't like when individuals get to opt in and opt out. The government likes to tell you what to do and when to do it.
Well, I think most people, though, realize that that freedom is very important because there's no way government can make the same choice for every family. My guess is, in tough times like these, most families would choose to work the extra month and take the year's worth of tax relief. In better times, perhaps they would choose to pay the extra tax and retire on schedule. But again, that would be their choice. And for the first time, would be linking the costs with the benefits, which is important because ultimately, we are all consumers of these services. This would give us accurate, rational price data to determine whether or not these benefits are worth it to our families according to our own best judgment.
Even if this proposal by Congressman Landry, for which you are, as you say, a cheerleader, becomes the law, isn't Social Security still at its heart a Ponzi scheme? Congress has confiscated the Social Security Trust Fund and has spent it. The whole program pays out more than it takes in, something which, if you or I did with other people's money, the government would prosecute us.
Well, it depends on a geometric progression of population, and unfortunately, that cannot be sustained. The first in do very well, the last in don't. That's the trajectory that we're on right now. Ultimately, that system will bankrupt in 2036, meaning that every Social Security recipient will see a sudden and permanent cut of about 25% from their benefits.
Unbelievable.
If we're going to avoid that, we've got to take action now to place that system back on a sustainable trajectory.
Congressman Tom McClintock, always a pleasure. Thanks for joining us.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
The revolution continues right here on Freedom Watch in just a moment. There was no love lost between big government Republicans Newt Gingrich and Mitt Romney on this weekend's GOP primary debate. But find out why the candidates had nothing but love for Ron Paul.
Congressman Paul got me really intrigued with the whole the Federal Reserve.
One of the things about Ron Paul that always amazes me is when I come to a debate like this, the only signs I see are the Ron Paul people out there freezing.
Political analyst Carl Jeffers tells us what this means. Plus, the fall of former Governor John Corzine's MF Global has cost investors across the world, including our own Bill Fleckenstein. We'll ask him what he's doing to recover his money. And coming up, happy 40th birthday to the Libertarian Party. Will it celebrate by selecting former Governor Gary Johnson as its presidential candidate in 2012? That would be a step toward upholding these principles. That government is best which governs least. The people are entitled to a government that stays within the confines of the Constitution. The Constitution was written to keep the government off the people's backs. These stories and more, only on...
Congressman Paul got me really intrigued with the whole the Federal Reserve.
And I happen to be with you on auditing the Fed and frankly on firing Bernanke.
He ignites an enthusiasm with a number of people that's very exciting to watch.
Very exciting to watch. Congressman Ron Paul wasting no time reveling in his popularity, released this new ad slamming frontrunner Newt Gingrich.
The year that he ran for Congress in 1978, he made a grand total of $10,000. By the time he became the Speaker, he made $675,000. By the time he left Congress, he's brought his net worth up to about $7.5 million.
84 ethics complaints while he was Speaker, driven out of the speakership in disgrace.
Having to pay $300,000 for lying, for complete fraud.
Marianne and I have lots of things to do, maybe earn a little bit of money. If you've been Speaker of the House, you're always an insider.
You're always an insider. Joining me now is Democratic insider and political analyst and good friend of the show, Carl Jeffers. Carl, it's a pleasure. Welcome back to Freedom Watch.
Good to be with you tonight,
Just teasing you, not necessarily comparing you to Newt Gingrich, but we obviously want your thoughts on this. What happens if Ron Paul
wins? And I can
wins?
certainly stand the comparison. I'll do well with that comparison.
All right, God bless you. What happens if Ron Paul wins the Iowa caucuses, meaning he gets a plurality, he gets more than anybody else, or he's so close to whoever finishes first that he cannot be overlooked?
I think that would do a couple of things. Number one, if Ron Paul were to win in Iowa, which I do not expect him to do, but if he were to win, that actually helps Mitt Romney. Because the ultimate perception is that Romney or Gingrich would be the candidate, and up until 2 weeks ago, that perception was only that Mitt Romney. And I still ultimately believe that Mitt Romney has the best chance to get the nomination, and I'm absolutely certain that he has the only chance of any Republican to defeat Barack Obama. But if Ron Paul wins in Iowa, that deflects, in a way, the momentum of Gingrich to stop Romney.
Understood.
And helps Romney to make that argument.
Understood, Carl.
Understood,
Carl. It makes a lot of sense. But why are we experiencing, in your view, the phenomenon this year of the front runner going backwards? It happened to Michelle Bachmann. It happened to Rick Perry. It happened to Herman Cain. Will it happen to Newt Gingrich?
Well, I think that, ironically, of all of the candidates, Newt Gingrich has the greatest potential to go backwards because he has demonstrated over his long career as a public servant, by the way. He's all of a sudden gotten very religious about his private sector and non-Washington involvement. For somebody who was Speaker of the House of Representatives, it's pretty hard to argue that you were somehow outside of Washington. But nevertheless, he is, in fact, the one who has already clearly established he has the potential to make miscues and implode, self-implode, with statements that could derail his candidacy more than the other candidates. I mean, it was a big surprise to everybody that Rick Perry turned out to be not ready for the national prime race. And so I think that would be a problem.
What will happen if Gary Johnson or Ron Paul doesn't get the nomination and capitalizes on the huge number of young people that are disenchanted with the current crop of Republican candidates and certainly disenchanted with the president. You know the type of person I'm talking about. They really believe in small government. They love Ron Paul. They love Gary Johnson. Some of them even love Ralph Nader. These people will come out and vote. What happens if one of them runs as a third-party candidate?
Well, I don't know many young people that love Ralph Nader, and certainly most of us who are old enough to remember what he did to Al Gore in 2000 don't love Ralph Nader, so we can leave his name out.
Okay.
But now Gary Johnson, as far as Gary Johnson is concerned, nothing happens if he doesn't get the Republican nomination, because he's not getting it, and he's not going to be credible as a third-party candidate. But I would put out a warning, and you've given me a great segue here. The thing that I think that the Republicans need to be very concerned about is, depending on who does get the nomination, and I think we can stipulate that we do not expect that Ron Paul will be the Republican nominee. Depending on who does get that nomination, Ron Paul might in fact consider a third-party challenge. And you know something, Judge? Not only could he, as a third-party candidate, possibly attract some young people who were originally drawn to the Tea Party, Ron Paul might even attract young people who are liberals, progressives, Democrats who have been disappointed in the Obama presidency, who do not feel that hope and change.
That was the crowd to which I was referring when I mentioned Ralph Nader.
Yes.
Carl, we appreciate your thoughts. Thanks for joining us.
You're welcome. Good to be with you tonight, Judge.
As Carl just indicated, libertarians worried about the rise of Gingrich may be taking matters into their own hands in the most important early primary state of all, Florida. Meet the candidate who is looking for his own chance to strike back against the Republicans who have rejected him. Is it a match made in heaven? Stick around to find out who this is. Governor Gary Johnson may have been shut out of the Republican debates, but there is a group that still holds out the former New Mexico governor in very high esteem. We're talking, of course, about Libertarian Party members from many states, including Florida. In Florida, they're meeting with Governor Johnson tonight, who is, as of now, a Republican candidate for president. The point is, he's specifically targeting a hugely important swing state with 29 electoral votes. If you want a bit of history for perspective, think back to Florida in the year 2000, when Ralph Nader made Florida too close to call, leading to a 2-month national nightmare called the recount. Governor Johnson, it's always a pleasure. Welcome back to Freedom Watch.
Great to be on with you, Judge. And libertarians are celebrating their 40th anniversary, and I don't think they have ever had a wing of big government within the Libertarian Party. Republicans, you know, I've always thought of Republicans as small government, but I don't know. Somehow Republicans, I think, have lost their way.
Well, they certainly lost their way in the Bush years. They will lose their way if Newt Gingrich or Mitt Romney is the nominee. Let's just suppose it is not Ron Paul and it is not you. What will you, Gary Johnson, a young, telegenic, much beloved, small government constitutionalist libertarian, do with your popularity and the millions who like you?
Well, you know, it's always been about the message, and running for president on the Republican side, I was hoping to provide stereo speakers on stage. At some point, I think it will become surround sound. I do believe that the fastest growing segment of the Republican Party is the libertarian wing of the Republican Party. So if Ron Paul doesn't get the nomination, this is a message that needs to continue. Ron Paul being a messenger, I think I'm in that same category.
Right,
look,
but what will you say to the libertarians who will have voted for you and for Congressman Paul in the primaries if it's Gingrich or Romney against Obama? Is it anybody but Obama because he's the most socialist-leaning president since FDR? Or is it the attitude that if we don't elect a small government Republican this year, we can kiss away small government for the next several generations? Which view will Gary Johnson take?
Look, I'm under the view that we need to balance the federal budget now. This country is all about inequality, not equality, which is what it should be. So if we're going to elect status quo, that's just what we're going to get is status quo. When Republicans are debating over a $1 trillion reduction in federal spending over 10 years, as opposed to a $1.4 trillion reduction now to balance the federal budget, that's not representative of a whole lot of Americans, in my opinion.
All right, you're in Florida tonight in order to meet with libertarians in Florida, and there are many, happily, there are many libertarians in the Sunshine State. What are you going to tell them when they ask you what I'm asking you now, which is, will you run as a third party, that is, libertarian candidate for president, if neither you nor Congressman Paul gets the Republican nod?
That is something I am absolutely considering, and it is due to the message. I'm just the messenger here. I realize the first few messengers get shot as they come over the hill, but it is about a message, and it's about changing the world. In this case, I hope not a little bit, because it needs to happen now. I'm in the camp that we're on the verge of a monetary collapse here.
All right. Governor Gary Johnson, thinking about a third-party run, still calling himself a Republican, and faithful to the ideals of small government. It's a pleasure, Governor. Thanks for joining us.
Judge, thank you.
When former MF Global CEO and former New Jersey Governor John Corzine takes the witness stand tomorrow again, our next guest will be watching very closely. Fleckenstein Capital President Bill Fleckenstein invested money with MF Global. He tells us who's to blame, Governor Corzine or the government, or both. He's next. And now a few items from our Freedom Files. A week of protests in Russia have led its president, Dmitry Medvedev, to call for a probe into last week's marred parliamentary elections, where Vladimir Putin's ruling party, also President Medvedev's party, won with just under 50% of the vote. But more than 95% of the vote in places like Chechnya, which once rebelled against Russian rule. That, however, is not enough for most protesters. Last week, the former Soviet leader, the last leader of the Soviet Union, Mikhail Gorbachev, who embraced Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher, and during whose tenure the Berlin Wall fell and the USSR collapsed, he called for a redo of the elections. The promise of freedom that came after the collapse of the Soviet Union lifted hundreds of millions of people around the world. But just 2 decades later, perhaps not surprisingly, Russia is again heading down the path of totalitarianism. In an Arizona high school, a visit by the local sheriff's office for a gun safety presentation went horribly wrong when a police canine somehow got out of a locked patrol car and mauled a 15-year-old girl. The police say they're investigating and consider themselves lucky. I would call them negligent. But the police did say the dog is trained to bite and pull. Police Captain Heriberto Zuniga said that didn't happen. It appears in this case the dog realized the girl did not pose a threat. Sounds like the dog had more sense than the cops. We're glad to report the girl and the dog are just fine now. The police accept no blame, and Arizona law does not permit them to be sued. I don't think this is a happy ending. It was another botched SWAT team raid in the war on drugs, and this time it will cost the city of Minneapolis $1 million. Recently, the Minneapolis police SWAT team served a search warrant by using a battering ram and a flash grenade. The grenade rolled under a couch where Rakia Russell was sitting, and it exploded there, causing 3rd and 4th degree burns on her. Police were looking for narcotics and firearms. They found nothing. Mrs. Russell, meanwhile, was arrested on a misdemeanor charge of, quote, having a disorderly house. Okay, guys, who made it disorderly? Mrs. Russell naturally sued the city and reached a settlement of $1 million. No discipline, however, was imposed on the cops, and none of them paid personally. It's another example of how the drug war hurts people, hurts law enforcement, hurts cash-strapped towns and cities, and accomplishes nothing good. Our next guest invested money in MF Global, the now bankrupt firm formerly headed by former New Jersey Governor John Corzine. Fleckenstein Capital CEO Bill Fleckenstein joins us now to tell us where he thinks the money went and who is to blame, the former governor of New Jersey or the government or both. Bill, welcome here. No matter what we talk about, it's always a pleasure to have you on, so welcome back to Freedom Watch.
Thanks for having me back.
What do you think happened with the money that you invested? Do you think that MF Global Management used it to pay corporate obligations, even though you entrusted it to them for their safekeeping and for your own investment purposes, not for theirs?
Yeah, let's be clear. I mean, I was a customer there at MF Global. I didn't invest any money in MF Global. Well, unfortunately, we still don't know exactly what happened. So it's hard to say, you know, for sure. I find it inconceivable that Corzine, the CEO, their CFO, and their president, both of who were on the tape additionally today, saying they don't know what happened to the money. It's impossible. If they don't know where the money went, I mean, not exactly, but generally,
right?
Then are they trying to imply that some underling stole it? I mean, we're talking about segregated funds. They're not supposed to be touched.
All right, tell me how this works. You give them X dollars. You authorize them only to do certain limited things with those X dollars, but you do not authorize them to take that X dollars and spend it on their own bills.
Well, exactly. I mean, so I had a small position of gold futures contracts there, and I had collateral there. In my case, I had way more collateral than I needed because I like to be over-collateralized. I kept my collateral in T-bills, believing that those T-bills would be securities in my name, and therefore, if there was a problem, I wouldn't be, you know, in the position I am now. I did not realize that in the case of potential fraud, although we don't know that it's fraud yet, I would be in the same soup as everyone else.
All right.
So,
one of the things that even small government people like you and me believe the government should do is to protect us from force and from fraud. Did the government protect you from fraud in this case? Stated differently,
No.
was Governor Corzine's regulator a friend and former employee of his who might not have been interested in protecting Bill Fleckenstein?
Well, no, Judge. I mean, the regulators did a bad job. But hey, what's new? I mean, look at all the regulators at the FDIC and Fannie and Freddie's regulators in the last housing bubble. The people who talk about more regulation, they don't ever seem to understand that the regulators haven't been doing their job. These financial institutions we should pass one new law, and that is all the directors and the officers of these financial entities should have to make up any capital shortfalls, which is the way it used to be in this country and the way it is in Switzerland now and Brazil. If that was the case, you think these guys would get leveraged 40 to 1 if all of Corzine's money was riding on him being right or not?
Do you think he'd be able to say under oath that he didn't know where the money went? Fleck, it's always a pleasure. Thanks for joining us. I hope you get all that money back, plus interest on it for keeping it from you. Do you know what president coerced the states into raising the drinking age to 21 with a transportation bill? Who could have signed such legislation? My freedom fighters on how and why the same big government bullying is still going on in this Congress. They're here next. A president of the United States signs a law that the Department of Transportation should keep federal highway funds from states that refuse to raise the drinking age to 21. South Dakota takes the issue to the Supreme Court, arguing that it's entitled to the funds without the federal strings attached. The court rules that Congress can bribe the states to do whatever it wants, and the states are free to accept or reject the funding with the terms. Who was that nanny state president who assaulted states' rights? Ronald Reagan. Today, your federal government funnels $40 billion of your taxpayer dollars every year to the states for highway spending. And a new report out tonight reveals the feds don't even care if the states use the funds once they are handed over, how they use the funds. So does the Reagan tradition of big government bribery live on? My freedom fighters love this one, and they're here to talk about it. Fox Business commodities expert and my colleague Sandra Smith, Ellis Hennigan, Newsday columnist, and Camille Foster, America's Future Foundation chair. Do you like these strings attached? Because you know it lets the federal government, the Congress, regulate in areas of human behavior kept away from it by the Constitution. In the South Dakota case, it was regulation of alcohol, which the 21st Amendment gives to the states.
Let me see if I can unwind this for you, Judge. The 21-year-old drinking thing has been a disaster. I mean, it has not saved lives. It has created binge. It has been a totally bad idea. However, you know, the states can be just as corrupt, sometimes more corrupt than the federal government. So if the feds give the states money and don't lean on the states, oftentimes the states do a worse job than the feds would have done. I want some crackdowns here.
Doesn't this let the federal government regulate in areas that the Constitution intentionally keeps from it by using the spending power to mold the states to their will?
Well, I think you just answered the question for me, Judge. It's unconstitutional. It's not right. This should not be happening. And in fact, with most of the states in the United States of America, the state that they're currently in, this money should be tracked, and we should know exactly what the states are doing with it. No strings should be attached whatsoever. It gives the Fed too much.
All right, so Camille, are you as a good libertarian torn between the concept of state sovereignty, the feds shouldn't interfere with it, and the concept of contract? If the states agreed to accept the money under certain terms, should they be obliged to comply with those terms?
Well, I'm not so torn up about it. For me, it's cut and dry. I think the federal government, if they want this, if the states need this money to build roads, then they probably shouldn't give it to the feds in the first place. Keep the money, build the roads yourself. We won't have any of these problems. Everybody is not, no one is surprised by the fact that the federal government is giving this money to the states and the states are wasting it. The one thing we're not paying attention to is this real threat to federalism here. This is an encroachment on states' rights by the federal government.
Isn't it also a form of bribery? Doesn't the federal government punish people or prosecute people for bribing others?
It's a form of bribery, but let's
doesn't bother you.
But well, not I want to let the 19-year-olds drink, the 20-year-olds drink.
Is the point of this underage drinking, or is the point of this the Congress perverting the Constitution?
Honestly, I understand the practical argument. I don't think the constitutional argument is that strong. You know what? You take the Fed's money, that it's going to come with some strings. It would be
I get your argument. As angry as we are about this, I think you're going to win because the court agrees with you. The culture inside the twin mortgage monsters, Fannie and Freddie, is almost too dense to believe. Despite costing you, the taxpayer, over $150 billion with a B dollars in bailouts, up and ringing, multiple accounting scandals, government workers inside Fannie and Freddie are whining about a little attention they're getting from federal investigators. They're complaining that the Inspector General is poring over the books and questioning every move they make, culminating in tell-all testimony before the Senate Banking Committee at 10 o'clock tomorrow. Capitol Hill's going to be a busy place. John Corzine in one room and these investigators in another. Should the federal government be investigating its own, Sandra Smith?
Absolutely. Time and time again, they have proven that they cannot make a sound decision. They should be poring over every decision that's made within Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac right now. And the heck with them. If they want to complain about it, they've proven their track record is horrible. They should be scrutinizing every decision that is made.
Shouldn't we know, isn't Sandra right, shouldn't we know why the taxpayers are on the hook for $151 billion and we can't trust Freddie and Fannie to tell us, so we have to have federal investigators go through federal books to tell us what federal people are doing with our federal dollars?
Yeah, definitely. But I'll take it a step further.
Go ahead.
You called it a monster earlier. This public-private monstrosity should be unwound. It's not a matter of investigating its continued operations. Let's get rid of it. Why do we still have Freddie and Fannie bucking around the mortgage market?
Are you persuaded that this monster is too big to be entrusted with our dollars, with your dollars out of Seneca?
I'm cool with these guys on that, and I like the Inspector General to be tough. But what concerns me is let's all go a step further. Come on, let's investigate the people who really did this, the bankers, the Wall Street people, the ones who really caused this crisis, Freddie and Fannie.
Let me get this straight.
That's a little thing over on the side.
Let me get this little thing over on the side says to the banks, lend all that money. It doesn't matter if those people have good credit. Give the mortgages to us and we'll put the taxpayers on the hook.
Listen, we just about wrecked the entire economy. Don't you want somebody to go to jail here?
I want to know why taxpayers got stuck with this money, because Congress set up a scheme by which taxpayers would get stuck.
Nobody made those greedy bankers make those crazy loans. They were trying to make
money. Isn't he, Sandra? Alice Hennigan is dead wrong.
They should. You're always wrong, actually, Ellis. You're always wrong. No, you're always wrong. And on occasion, we like to side with you. I'm going to tell you right now, Judge, that something has to be done. This guy was brought in there. This investigator was brought in there to be tough.
Fine.
Is the timing a little off? Yes, you might add.
Why do you want to insulate the bank?
I'm not going to stand up for the bankers here at all. Sure, you want to investigate the bankers, so be it. If there is a crime that was committed, I say prosecute it. Right. There is no doubt, however, that the government's interference in the market created moral hazard that had the banks act in a particular way. Fannie and Freddie said played a central role in the unraveling of our economy.
Didn't Fannie and Freddie provide an incentive for banks to lend to whomever they wanted and then sell those mortgages to the government?
Absolutely. There isn't any doubt about it. I don't know anyone who's arguing against it.
Camille Foster, Sandra Smith, Ellis Hennigan, who doesn't like to be silenced. Thank you very much for joining us, guys. Exposing the folly of a payroll tax. Exposing a government that can't have a budget for more than 9 months. Next. Does the government work for us or do we work for the government? The federal government is about to run out of money again, and the two wings of the big government party are at odds over how much money to borrow and give away again. Tonight, does the government know what it's doing again? Since Barack Obama became president on January 20th, 2009, the federal government has not had a budget. It did not have one for the first 2 years of his presidency when the Democrats controlled both houses of Congress. And it has not had one for 2011 when the Democrats have controlled the Senate and the Republicans have controlled the House. The Senate, continuously under Democratic control during the entire Obama presidency, has not voted out and sent to the House any annual budget since George W. Bush was the president. The House sent a budget to the Senate early this year, but the Senate rejected it and sent nothing back in return. In the nearly 3 years that President Obama has been in office, the government has been collecting revenue, borrowing cash, and spending ravenously on the basis of what the government calls continuing resolutions, known in Washington by the initials CR. When Congress enacts a CR, it basically authorizes the government to operate for a finite and brief period of time. The period of time does not coincide with the government's fiscal year. The federal government's fiscal year runs from October 1st to September 30th. Here we are in early December, and your government does not have a budget for the fiscal year that began over 2 months ago. Instead, the federal government has operated under 14 continuing resolutions throughout the Obama presidency. Some of these CRs have been for as long as 9 months, and one was for as short as 24 hours. The 14th of these CRs, the one that governs what the feds can spend today, expires at the end of this week. Now, there was a time when the end of a continuing resolution would have brought intense media scrutiny. Will the government stay open? Will it shut down? Who will get blamed? Will the Congress let the president spend money that the government doesn't even have? None of this produces drama any longer because the bizarre has now become the routine. Today, we are 3 weeks to the end of the year, and the new year will bring new tax rates, specifically for the payroll tax. As you know, America, the payroll tax is what you pay and what your employer pays to fund Social Security. As you also know, Social Security is a Ponzi scheme. It pays out more than it takes in, and the government lies about its solvency. It once had a cushion called the Social Security Trust Fund, but Congress took that money and spent it. Can you think of any crimes here? Running a Ponzi scheme is a crime. Just ask Bernie Madoff. And spending money that you have lawfully agreed to hold in trust for someone else can get you in a lot of hot water and maybe even criminal charges. Just ask John Corzine. So here we are, 3 days to the end of the current continuing resolution, and 3 weeks to the end of the year and tax increases. And employers and employees don't know what their payroll taxes will be on January 2nd. You cannot run a business, and you should never run your household without planning beyond 3 weeks. But when you have a government in which both wings of the big government party, that's the Republican wing as well as the Democratic wing, thinks it can bribe the people with their own money, the only difference between the two is how much of a bribe. When both wings of big government think they can write any law and regulate any behavior and tax any event, no matter what the Constitution says, no matter what federal law says, no matter what the laws of economics say, is it any wonder the government is dysfunctional? All of this demonstrates that the government lives in its own world. It writes laws for the rest of us and breaks them for itself. It requires openness of corporations that trade publicly, but it won't be transparent itself. It doesn't read the laws it writes, and it doesn't care about the Bill of Rights. What can we do? All right, if you want a stocking stuffer that addresses all this, you can pick up my new book, It is Dangerous to Be Right When the Government is Wrong, and give it to anyone who loves freedom. Or even give it to some loopy but lovable relative of yours who loves big government. And if you are in Iowa or New Hampshire, you can vote next month for a game changer. There is only one on the ballot. From New York, defending freedom every night of the week. So long, America.